It is the early 90s, and there is crisis at Nintendo. Sales of the Game Boy were slowing down, development of the Nintendo 64 is stuck in a hell of technical difficulties, and salvation will come from the hands of one very unlikely product. And the weird part is, Nintendo almost ruined this product right before it came out, and it all has to do with one small detail on its side. So, what happened? Let's go back to the end of the 80s as the Game Boy finally hit store shelves in Japan. While the initial press was a little bit skeptical of the very outdated monochromatic screen, in reality the device immediately sold out on the back of games like Super Mario Land and led to widespread shortages all over Japan. What was already an extraordinarily successful device went into Super Saiyan mode with the introduction of what will become the most successful video game of all time, and the frankly galaxy brain move by Nintendo of America of packing the Game Boy with Tetris instead of Mario, which ensured the device will sell and sell and sell. The Game Boy team and RD1 welcomed the news. The development of the device had been an absolute nightmare, and many of them were not eager to jump into the grinder yet again. Division leader Gunpei Yokoi was worn out from all the infighting, betrayal, and drama that dominated the development of the Game Boy, to the point that it took him 2 years to come up with a new project. In reality, by his own confession in his biography, he wanted to retire from Nintendo and create a small company where he could go back to the smaller projects and toys he actually enjoyed making, away from the high-tech mega product Nintendo was now laser focused on making. But, loyal to his sense of honor and to his company, he did not want to leave after 2 years of seemingly no progress in his work, so he decided to try one more product before he retired. Satoru Okada, his second-in-command and the one who had fought to make the Game Boy a fully fledged console and not just a toy, chose to skip out on the next project, quite possibly as exhausted with the drama as Yokoi was. The next project was gearing up to be Yokoi's latest and most ambitious, and hopefully its most successful, and it came to be known as the Virtual Boy. How the Virtual Boy worked and why it failed so catastrophically might be better suited to a video on its own, but it is fair to say it remained the worst commercial failure Nintendo had experienced since pivoting to video games. If Yokoi did not want to leave Nintendo after 2 years of no new products, living in the middle of his worst failure was even worse, especially considering the generalized nervousness inside Nintendo at the time. The Super Famicom from his rival Uemura had been a success, but had not quite lived up to the astronomical sales of the original Famicom, and his team was really struggling to develop the follow-up, the Nintendo 64, which left Nintendo with a pretty dangerous gap on its release schedule. Exhausted, Yokoi started wondering, what would be a product easy and quick to develop that will work as a surefire success and allow him to leave the company with his pride intact? As Yokoi wondered where his easy ticket out of Nintendo might be, a seemingly unrelated conversation with a friend during 1995 brought some unexpected inspiration. Something interesting was happening in Japan in the 90s, and I just do not mean whatever the commercial makers were drinking. Their advances in portable electronics were ushering a golden era of mobile phones years before the rest of the world. Yokoi noticed that his friend had bought a mobile phone, which was odd because his friend had long resisted the idea of getting such a device. The friend explained that he had been avoiding phones because he found them bulky and uncomfortable, but that during the last years, affordable phones had finally become small enough that they could fit in the palm of his hand. And there it was, the insight he so desperately needed, the simple idea that will allow him to finally retire. He will make the Game Boy again, but smaller. A Game Boy that could fit in a shirt pocket. This is the Game Boy Pocket. Compared to the chaos of developing the original bulky Game Boy, the Game Boy Pocket was easy. The general insides of the device could only need a light redo, and only one major change will be needed to make the device dramatically smaller, as the thing that occupied the most space on the original Game Boy was actually the battery. When I first noticed this, I spent way too long doing some major research trying to figure out how was this achieved. After all, the whole freaking point of the original Game Boy was to prioritize battery life, so they must have done some pretty crazy power optimization on this device to cut battery requirements this dramatically. Was it a new CPU, more efficient memory, a more efficient RAM? Nope. Not at all. As usual, the answer was staring at me right along. The disposable AA and AAA batteries we all know and maybe love had been in circulation since 1907. Wow, okay, yeah, I was very surprised too. In 1950, a Canadian chemical engineer called Lewis Urey was working on a replacement to this ancient design that much improved the chemical reaction and added an alkaline dielectric. All in all, its energy storage was 2 times larger or even more than previous batteries at the time, and came to be known simply as alkaline batteries. Urey had to work for decades to improve its design, as people in his company didn't quite believe this will be a success at all, but by the 80s, Lewis finally nailed a design for the batteries that his company commercialized, and it became so successful that nowadays it is difficult to find disposable batteries that are not alkaline. By the way, that company Urey invented this for, the one that didn't quite believe this project will actually be that impactful, it's called Energizer. You might have heard of them. Alkaline batteries quickly took over the entire disposable battery industry, and it was truly a revolution. Suddenly, the most popular AA batteries in every store from the US to Japan lasted 3 times as long, and most commercials at the time really wanted you to know that. Maybe it was not just Japan, maybe the entire advertisement industry was going through a phase at the time. Thanks to Energizer and its batteries, the original Game Boy rose to a dramatic 30 hours of battery life, way past the targets of what R&D1 intended. So even using 2 batteries instead of 4 and a smaller, lower capacity AAA batteries, the newer Game Boy could significantly be smaller and still have more than 10 hours of battery life. The only question left was if the device will succeed at the level necessary for Yokoi to happily retire with a win. This was not an insignificant concern. The original Game Boy was already relatively technologically weak at release, and the industry has started the process of moving towards the exciting world of 3D gaming. Game Boy handhelds and game sales had both started to slow down, and third-party support was waning, and it was not a surefire thing that the Pocket was enough to revitalize all of that. Once again, the history of Nintendo Volume 4 by gaming historian and manga translator Florent Gorges, based on direct interviews to ex-members of R&D1, reveals how ultimately the success of the Pocket was basically down to timing and luck. President Yamauchi was unconvinced the device will revitalize sales without some dramatic measures and demanded the device be sold at 6,800 yen. Considering this was nearly half the target price of the original Game Boy, this put some unexpected pressure on what was supposed to be a fairly easy project, and led to some intense debates inside the team as to what functions to cut to achieve this. And one of the most controversial issues was the cable link port. One of the selling points of the original Game Boy was the link cable, an optional accessory that allowed multiplayer action between 2 devices. Every meeting turned into a fight, as the hardware and software team could not agree on the destiny of the link cable. The hardware team, led by an engineer of rising influence called Takehiro Isushi, argued that barely any games were selling because of the link cable, and the port was a significant source of cost for the device. For the software team, the idea of removing that was ludicrous, as the link cable was one of the strongest distinguishing features of the Game Boy, and it will break full compatibility with a large variety of games. Ultimately, Isushi and the hardware team compromised and agreed to include a link cable port that was smaller and cheaper, as they figured the link cable would not be used enough by people for that to become a problem. You know, what could possibly require the link cable that badly? Well, funny story about that. While this whole debate was happening, Nintendo was running a trade show called the Space World. That year, all eyes were set on the reveal of the Nintendo 64, Nintendo's first fully 3D capable console. Almost entirely forgotten, in a corner, a booth for a small third-party game stood. The company making the game had started as a game magazine publisher, of all things, and had a few years ago pivoted towards game development, making a few projects for the Super Famicom, the Game Boy, and even the Sega Mega Drive. And now the company was trying to show its original new IP to a largely uninterested public. A new unknown IP from a relatively unknown company on an outdated portable handheld that was reaching the tail end of its life was not exactly competition for the hype around the Nintendo 64. That new IP for the Game Boy was Pokemon Red and Blue. If you weren't alive or active in video game circles in the 90s, it is difficult to correctly express just how popular Pokemon was. Remember that glorious month in 2016 when Pokemon Go first released and the entire world seemed to stop just to play the damn game? Okay, imagine that for 5 freaking straight years. Pokemon didn't just revitalize the Game Boy marketplace, it drove it to new heights that eclipsed all previous successes, and generated a bigger second wave of interest, and more importantly, its deep integration with the link cable and the trade functionality meant it quickly became the killer app for the Game Boy and the link cable. With Pokemon releasing a few months before the Game Boy Pocket, its success largely and instantly made the Game Boy Pocket the hottest product coming from Nintendo that generation, and it gave the software team and R&D1 much reason to gloat at the hardware team that nearly took the cable link port out. In fact, on the interviews conducted by Florent, Isushi mentions that to this day, every time he crosses paths with Satoshi Tajiri, the director of the Pokemon games, he recalls how much he fought to remove the link cable port and experiences a significant amount of past cringe. Nevertheless, the Game Boy Pocket was a huge success that conditioned Nintendo to release mid-life versions of their handhelds for the rest of freaking eternity, and it was the success Gunpei Yokoi desperately needed and waited for. Barely weeks after the release of the Pocket, Yokoi handed his resignation to President Yamauchi, and no amount of effort from the president could change his mind. Yokoi's resignation caused some mixed reactions within the company. Some, like Yoshihiro Taki, the very same engineer that had the difficult task of ghosting Citizen and might have accidentally contributed to the design of the Game Gear, that's all from the previous video, left Nintendo with Yokoi to form Kotolab, a small company where they could work on smaller toys and have more control over their projects. Some, like legendary musician Hip Tanaka, felt shocked and betrayed and swore to show Yokoi that he was wrong about Nintendo, which ended in some really weird consequences, but that's quite literally a story for another video, which I will post and you can watch right now in my streaming service Nebula, link in the description. For others like Satoru Okada, who had ruined his friendship with Yokoi to make the Game Boy closer to a Pocket Famicom, and Masayuki Uemura, the leader of the rival Famicom division, it was a bit of a relief. It was obvious that Yokoi was uncomfortable with Nintendo as a gaming company and that he did not feel at ease playing the internal game of politics that was necessary to get projects done inside the company. Sadly, the story of Yokoi does not get the happy ending he wanted or deserved. A bit over a year after leaving Nintendo and founding Kotolab, Yokoi had a tragic traffic accident and passed away, leaving the reins of all the projects at Koto to Taki, who had so loyally followed him from Nintendo. Outside of Japan, we often know Yokoi as the father of the Game Boy, a title that might obscure too much of the enormous contributions of others like Okada, who led the vision of what the Game Boy could actually be. But in Japan, Yokoi is known by a title that maybe he will have appreciated a bit more: the God of Toys, a reference to the many inventions through which he contributed to the childhood of millions. Back at Nintendo, the direction of R&D1 was laid in the hands of the director of hardware, Isushi, the very same guy who had almost got the link cable removed. And while he was shocked by Yokoi's death, the team continued working. The improvements in battery life using alkaline batteries were so good, they realized that they could, using more modern screens, go back to using AA batteries and conceivably include a backlight to play without the need of an external light. To everyone inside R&D1, this will have been the last iteration of the Game Boy, the perfect distillation of the 8-bit handheld before moving on to a better technology. So if this is the first time you hear about the Game Boy Light, you might be thinking to yourself, what? The definite version of the Game Boy? How have I never heard of this? And oh my god, why is it so expensive? Well, the answer has to do with what Yokoi was doing before dying at Koto Laboratory, and how it will throw Nintendo into an absolute chaos. But that is literally a story for the next time. Don't worry, you won't have to wait long. The video is almost done and I will link it in the description or just in the corner. But either way, Yokoi's departure triggered a bunch of events that would change Nintendo forever. One of them, unexpectedly, was the creation of the Game Boy camera, which is a story involving a musician searching for revenge and some lewd pictures. I am not making that up. So I just spun it off as a separate video that you can find in Nebula. In fact, One of the reasons why a lot of us have been able to elevate the quality of the content we're doing is because of Nebula. It's because it's a streaming service that we own and that we control, and that allows us to put extended versions without having to worry about retention so much. In fact, while I was editing this video for the sake of retention, I had to cut yet another section about the improvements done to the Game Boy Pocket screen and the technology used there, which killed me to remove because he had some pretty nice 3D renders. But hey, I uploaded the full director cut of the video Nebula with the extra part, so you get a longer base video and the companion video. As a creator, I'm so happy to have Nebula. Original content like my documentary about RuneScape gold farmers in Venezuela, or my original podcast where I interview other creators to get their origin story.